Hello, everybody. I'm AnastassiosLiambas, Associate Professor of Pedagogy and Student Assessment in the School of Primary Education at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. I'm delighted to be here, and it is an honor and a pleasure for me, my colleagues and students, to welcome Giroux at our School of Education. A school who is the pioneer of the great tradition of critical and liberatory pedagogy in the Greek academia. As its scholars many years ago, since 1993, have started offering both graduate and postgraduate courses and modules directly related to the values, the context, and the foundation of critical and liberatory pedagogy. Our school has also organized the 4th International Conference on Critical Education in 2014 and has taken on the organization and carrying out of the 10th International Conference, which is going to take place here, hopefully after the pandemic. Since 2017, our school has also organized and delivered 4 summer schools on critical pedagogy and education, while many articles and books have been produced by members of our school in this field. Our latest development has been the creation of an online journal dedicated to critical education. Though it's hard to condense in a few words the entire spectrum of the Giroux work, it is important to offer some few biographical notes for the needs of tonight's online public conversation. Giroux holds the McMaster University Chair for Scholarship in the Public Interest in the English and Cultural Studies Department, and is the Paulo Freire Distinguished Scholar in Critical Pedagogy. He has published more than 70 books and an asterisk here, since none of them have been translated into Greek. 200 chapters and 500 articles published widely throughout education and cultural studies literature. Though one could adhere to the view that in the last 40 years his work has shifted from critical pedagogy, school curriculum, the social foundation, and the sociology of education, policy issues in education to culture, cultural politics, media, youth studies, social justice, marginality, the politics of resistance, equity, and anti-oppression. His texts always have located these discourses within the pattern script of the neoliberal articulation that allow capitalism to absorb and reconfigure neoconservative politics and hence preserve their dominance. Power politics and critical pedagogy become central to public pedagogy and border pedagogy, which could anticipate education as the engine of reproduction. Nowadays, his work is vital for an understanding of contemporary societies, since the advanced industrial societies and their governments have exposed horrific practices into all facets of human life, within traditional understandings of education and culture's broader pedagogical imperatives, thus promoting new characteristics in man's personality, agency, and culture. Receiving shallow education, accomplishing homogeneity, consensus, attracted by consumerism, and the abolition of collective action in a fragmented but coercive reality. Giroux is deeply concerned about the current state of democracy and about the combination of neoliberalism, economic fundamentalism, and the influence of the military-industrial prison nexus and the religious fundamentalism that pose continuing attacks on public schools, social spending, and other institutions. All of which result, in effect, in an attack on youth, and especially poor youth from ethnic minorities who are increasingly marginalized or thrown on the economic and social scrap heap as disposable. In his writings, he advocates for an education strived towards radical democratization and justice, strongly influenced by Paulo Freire, neo-Marxism, and critical theory, realizing that though democracy nowadays in fact oppresses opinions, classes, races, genders, and worldviews to build consent, he envisions and works for a revitalized public sphere within respect for difference, which could enhance hope, dialogue, and praxis. Giroux, as a sincere organic intellectual of praxis, stands as a constant reminder of how the world operates, consistent in encourage people to think differently about the world and society, to edify solidarity, hope, and care, Over the last decade, he offers a critique of capitalism and the crimes committed by the people pushing neoliberalism, promoting understanding, and has ways for social life spaces of theory and action for people to be engaged in emancipatory routes. Professor Giroux, despite the fact that many teachers, academics, and people are elaborating a cause for a just and emancipated world, we are acquainted with your work and ethos. So we look forward to a conversation with you, which could provide a unique chance to become further knowledgeable and enlightened while being in the heart of a crisis. On the far-right neoliberal agenda and the critical teacher stance, we would like to hear your thoughts about pedagogy education during the last years. Obama-Trump period, your concerns on the manner of education, primary, secondary, tertiary, that has become the arena where the ideology of the new alternative right and the new norms culture of fascism are entangled with neoliberal economic processes. Hence, the new normality of a dystopia affecting the core of democracy itself. And finally, to highlight for us the ways to accomplish a counter-hegemonic resist, ways to fulfill a prospect to strengthen democracy. From the moment education policies are interwoven with contemporary politics, the significance of your contribution is prime on the mode many teachers and citizens think, reflect, and act.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As the deputy head of the School of Primary Education here at Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to welcome you all here tonight. Our online event is a very special one indeed. It is a very special one because we have with us a distinguished theorist of critical pedagogy, a prolific and inspirational writer, and a public intellectual who has dedicated his life and academic career to being a powerful voice for radical democratization, political transformation, and the restructuring of education. Professor Giroux, thank you for being with us tonight. On behalf of all of us here at the School of Education, I'd like to say that it is both an honor and a privilege to welcoming you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm truly honored to be here. And I especially want to thank Giannis for all the letters and exchanges and the patience that he exhibited in convincing me to do this wonderful talk. Let me give you a sense of what I'd like to do. You know, for the last 40 years, I've been deeply concerned not only about schooling and education and the rise of authoritarianism in various countries throughout the world, but I've been particularly concerned about the rise of neoliberalism and how it's become a global ideological force for basically undermining the basic tenets of democracy. In many ways, what people have written about, who have now written about this extensively, have written about it as an economic, basically, and structural force, whereas that's not to be ignored. What I've written about is how neoliberalism functions as an educational force in shaping particular forms of identities, particular values, and so forth and so on. What I've been extremely concerned about lately in the age of the pandemic is the way neoliberalism has basically morphed into a form of neoliberal fascism. And basically how the worst dimensions of economic austerity have now coupled with, in many ways, the language of racial cleansing and what we might call white supremacy. So the question for me is, how do you both understand this with this new political formation, and how do we talk about education as a way of basically both penetrating, revealing, and offering modes of resistance that would be central? It seems to me to be both fighting this and overcoming it. So with that said, as an introduction, let me begin with a very short talk, maybe 12 minutes, but I think it brings together a lot of the elements that I've been working with, though in relatively general terms. Just as the 2008 global economic crisis revealed the failure of liberal democracy and the scourge of neoliberalism, the pandemic crisis of 2020 has revealed how institutions meant to serve the public good and offer support for progressive policies now serve authoritarian ideologies and a ruling elite that views democracy as the enemy of market-based freedoms, while also celebrating the forces of ultranationalism and the dictates of white supremacy. Across the globe, democratic institutions such as the independent media, schools, the legal system, health systems, certain financial institutions, and higher education are under siege. The promise, if not the ideals of democracy, are receding as the barbarians who breathe new life into a fascist past are once again on the move, subverting language, values, civic courage, vision, critical consciousness, and of course in Greece, beating up students. Education has increasingly become a tool of domination as right-wing pedagogical apparatuses controlled by entrepreneurs of hate attack workers, the poor, people of color, refugees, immigrants, and others considered disposable. The present moment is once again at an historical conjuncture in which the structures of liberation and authoritarianism are vying for shaping a future that appears to be either an unthinkable nightmare or a realizable dream. The global thrust towards democratization that emerged after World War II is giving way once again to authoritarian tyrannies. As alarming as the signs may be, the public cannot look away and allow the terrors of the unforeseen to be given free rein. For those who believe in democratic socialism, we cannot allow the power of dreams and militant hopes to turn to ashes. Since the 1970s, a form of predatory capitalism called neoliberalism has waged war on the welfare state, public sphere, and the common good. The new mode of governance argues that the market should govern the economy and all aspects of society, not just the economy. It concentrates wealth in the hands of a financial elite and elevates untrampled self-interest, unchecked individualism, deregulation, and privatization as the governing principles of society, among others. Under neoliberalism, everything is for sale, and the only obligation of citizenship is consumerism. We live in an age when economic activity is divorced from social cost, while policies that produce racial cleansing, militarism, and staggering levels of inequality have become the defining feature of everyday life. This is very important. When I argue that economic activity under neoliberalism is removed from social cause, what in fact you hear here is the death of social responsibility, the death of government responsibility, the death of any kind of concern that doesn't elevate profits over basically human needs. At the same time, the COVID-19 plague has revealed how a market-driven social order ignores basic human needs such as healthcare, food, decent wages, and quality education. Neoliberalism views government as the enemy of the market, limits society to the realm of the family and individuals, embraces a kind of fixed hedonism, and challenges the very idea of the public good. The pandemic revealed in all of its ugliness the death-producing mechanisms of systemic inequality, deregulation, a culture of cruelty, and an increasingly dangerous assault on the environment. That is, an education that equips individuals to think critically, engage in thoughtful dialogue, appropriate the lessons of history, and learn how to govern rather than be governed. It's hard to imagine a more urgent moment for taking seriously attempts to make education central to politics. At stake here is the notion that education is a moral and political project rooted in the goal of emancipation for all people. Moreover, this is an education that encourages and expands upon human agency, one that enables people to not only be critical thinkers, but also engaged individuals and social agents. If we're going to develop a politics capable of awakening our critical, imaginative, and historical sensibilities, it's crucial for educators and others to remember that education is essential to creating the agents, the identities, and the values that create an engaged and informed citizenry. In the United States right now, what we are seeing is an attack on the public imagination, which literally normalizes ignorance, literally normalizes a kind of thoughtlessness, literally normalizes the notion that justice really is not as important as injustice, that reason is not as important as a kind of overly intensified form of emotion that allows people to say and do whatever they like, even taking off masks, so that even though they might be endangering the lives of others. The notion of individual freedom has been so exaggerated that it no longer has anything to do with the social good, except to undermine it. Central to the current political moment is developing a language of critique and possibility. Such a language is necessary, it seems to me, to reveal, resist, and overcome the tyrannical fascist nightmares that have descended upon the United States, Brazil, and a number of other European countries plagued by the rise of right-wing populist movements and neo-Nazi parties. In an age of social isolation, information overflow, a culture of immediacy, consumer glut, and spectacularized violence, it's all the more crucial to take seriously the notion that democracy cannot exist or be defended without civically literate and critically engaged citizens. At the same time, we must remember this is not a call simply for critical consciousness or for critical thinking, because it seems to me that ideas have to be wedded to power. Education, both in its symbolic and institutional forms, has a central role to play in fighting the resurgence of fascist cultures, mythic historical narratives, a culture of lies, and the emerging of white supremacy and white nationalism. Moreover, as fascists across the globe are disseminating toxic, racist, and ultra-nationalist images of the past, it's essential to reclaim education as a form of historical consciousness and moral witnessing. This is especially true at a time when historical and social amnesia have undermined the foundations of civic culture, matched only by the masculinization of the public sphere and the increasingly normalization of a fascist politics that thrives on ignorance, fear, the suppression of dissent, and hate. Education as a form of cultural work extends far beyond the classroom, and its pedagogical influences are crucial to challenging and resisting the rise of pedagogical formations and the rehabilitation, of course, of fascist principles and ideas. I mean, it's a very important point for my work. I mean, what I'm basically trying to understand is how education functions within the larger culture itself, not simply in schools. And I think that it would be fair to argue that education outside of school has probably become the most powerful pedagogical force now shaping the 21st century, particularly in the advanced countries of the West. The pedagogical lesson here is that neoliberal fascism, the conjoining of savage forms of market-based austerity and the discourse of racial cleansing, begins with hateful words, the demonization of others considered disposable, and the emergence of the carceral state and the horrors of detention jails and camps, and of course, systemic police violence. Critical pedagogy provides the promise of a protected space within which to think against the grain and received opinion, a space to question and challenge, to imagine the world from different standpoints and perspectives, and to reflect upon ourselves in relation to others, so as to understand what it means to assume a sense of political and social responsibility. This suggests that one of the most serious challenges facing educators is the task of developing discourses and pedagogical practices that connect critical reading of both the world and the word in ways that enhance the creative capacities of young people and provide the conditions for them to become critical agents. In taking up this project, educators and others should attempt to create the conditions that give students the opportunity to acquire the knowledge, the values, and the civic courage that enable them to struggle in order to make this desolation and cynicism unconvincing and hope practical. As you all know, we're in the midst of a neoliberal plague in which education now is haunted by the dictates of managerialism, bureaucracy, standardization, objectification, endless meetings that go nowhere, a mode of governance that has nothing to do with respecting the dignity of teachers, students seen as clients and customers, faculty being reduced to part-time positions. This is truly about the death of the university. Educated hope is not a call to overlook the difficult conditions that shape schools and the larger social order, nor is it a blueprint removed from specific contexts and struggles. On the contrary, it's the precondition for imagining a future that does not replicate the nightmares of the present, for not making the present the future. Educated hope should be an active pedagogical practice that dignifies the labor of teachers, offers up critical knowledge linked to democratic social change, affirms shared responsibilities, and encourages students and teachers to recognize ambivalence and uncertainty as fundamental dimensions of learning. It seems to me that hope must be tempered by the complex reality of the times and viewed as a project for the condition for providing a sense of collective agency, opposition, political imagination, and engaged participation. Without hope, even in the direst of times, there's no possibility for resistance, dissent, struggle. Agency is the condition of struggle, and hope is the condition of agency. Hope expands the space of the possible and becomes a way of recognizing and naming the incomplete nature of the present. This is particularly important at a time when neoliberalism operates off the assumption that there's no alternative to it, that in fact the world of neoliberalism is the only world. As Margaret Thatcher once said, that's all there is. Well, that's not all there is. And it seems to me if the public imagination is to be able to think outside of that suffocating discourse, one that collapses the future into the present and then eternalizes it and normalizes it, it seems to me that hope becomes more than a wish. It becomes a struggle, becomes a basis for agency, becomes a basis for politics, and it becomes a basis for not only thinking otherwise, but acting otherwise. The current fight against a growing fascist politics across the globe is not only a struggle over economic structures or the commanding heights of corporate power, it's also a struggle over visions, ideas, consciousness, identifications, the power of persuasion, and the ability to shift the culture itself. It's also a struggle to reclaim historical memory. Any struggle for a radical democratic social order will not take place if the lessons of our dark past cannot be learned. And it seems to me that if they can't be learned, then they will simply be repeated. In the age of nascent fascism, it's not enough to connect education with the defense of reason, informed judgment, or critical agency. It must also be aligned with the power and potential of collective resistance. Think of the communists in the Greek Civil War and that notion of resistance and what it meant. That's a model to think about. We may live in dark times, but the future is still open. The time has come to develop a political language and pedagogical tools in which the values, the social responsibility, and institutions that support them become central to invigorating and fortifying a new era of civic imagination, a new sense of social agency, collective struggle, and an impassioned sense of civic courage and political will. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Giroux. Thank you very much indeed for your powerful and inspirational speech. I will now hand over the floor to Yannis Kaskaris, a teacher and an activist and a friend. And I call him to pose maybe a couple of questions.
Hello, everyone. Hello from me. Well, there are a set of questions from the audience. I have grouped them. Well, quite a few people ask if you consider that we're in the middle of, if you consider that if you consider that this is not only a pandemic crisis, but it's also a neoliberal crisis as well, and how this will influence to build and struggle for a counter-hegemonic agency in political action.
I mean, I think that one of the things that might be taken up that is obvious, to me anyways, is that the pandemic crisis is not just a medical crisis, it's a political and ideological crisis. And in fact, it was made worse by neoliberalism itself, which refused to invest in public health, refused to invest basically in eliminating systemic forms of equality, allowed enormous differences, class, racial, and otherwise to develop that made it all the more difficult to address the pandemic. So I think that what we've seen with the pandemic is not only the failure of neoliberalism and market values to address important social issues, but we've seen an opening. And I think that what that opening is one that suggests that neoliberalism is not has nothing to do with democracy. It has everything to do with injustice. And I think that by revealing that power, which has often been invisible in the past, we can begin to talk about things that often have not been talked about. And that is, what does it mean to have a society that eliminates systemic equality? What does it mean to take the public good seriously? What does it mean to defend schools in the national interest of a democratic movement? What does it mean to organize teachers and educators across the globe into an international force for the defense of public goods? I mean, it seems to me that neoliberalism is not only responsible for the pandemic, but in many ways it has accelerated the rise of repressive measures all over the world in the name of the pandemic. Whether we see what's happening in Turkey, whether we see what's happening in the Philippines, whether we see the arrests of people who are dissenting, whether we see what's happening in France, whether we see what's happening in Greece with people demonstrating and the police beating them up senselessly. I mean, these issues, we cannot separate the pandemic from neoliberalism as both a cause and as an accelerant. And we cannot separate any logic of political struggle from, in some way, not making those connections clear.
And there is another set of questions relating to the ways that there is an absence from the left of a general political project for actual social transformation. Do you think that education is as an agency is simply the best way to proceed towards a vision of hope and a vision of an emancipated future? And
I think education, Giannis, is central to politics. And I think it's central to politics because in the most essential way, it's a struggle over the hearts and souls of people. It's a struggle over agency. It's a struggle over consciousness. It's a struggle over knowledge and its relationship to power. It's a struggle over identifications. It's a struggle over how we understand a future that in some fundamental way allows people to come together, face the forces of domination, and struggle collectively. I mean, I will say this. If you look at neoliberalism in the current moment, we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to govern rather than be governed? How do we theoretically and politically unpack that major political concern? If we don't have people who have a consciousness capable of understanding the conditions that bear down on them, they're incapable of governing. I mean, all they can be is governed. So I think there are three things I want to say about this. I want to say that one, education is central to politics because consciousness is central to politics. If you don't understand issues, you can't act on them. Or if you misunderstand them, you act separately. Thirdly, it seems to me that education becomes an accelerant to bring people together to learn how to struggle collectively rather than individually. Neoliberalism operates off the assumption that the individual and self-interest are the most important aspects of the social order. This is a form of depoliticization because it prevents people who believe that all problems are individual problems from basically being able to translate private issues into larger social systemic considerations. So education becomes a form of translation that allows us to bring these elements together and to be able to see in some ways larger issues. Now, the third issue regarding the left. The left has made a terrible mistake in the last 50 years, it seems to me, on two fronts. First, it doesn't take education seriously. It doesn't recognize that education is so central to politics that we basically have to talk about what it means to be able to speak to people in ways that can understand what we say. It doesn't have a politics of identification in place that allows them to recognize that we have to touch people's lives so that people can see in the discourses and the movements we provided, they can see themselves and what it means to be able to shift their consciousness. Thirdly, it seems to me that the left is so fractured in many ways around diverse movements, which have been wonderful in expanding the range of oppressions that we face under neo-fascist, neoliberal governments. But at the same time, they've become so fragmented that we don't have a way to bring them together under an umbrella, call it what you may, radical democracy, democratic socialism, in which we can both see these different moments, these various identities, these various struggles as crucial, but limited in their ability to create mass movements.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions from the audience. What can we do? There is one question. What can we do to prevent this crisis from the consequences to us and to our children? And Andrei Christodoulou asks, is it possible for democracy to be alive in capitalism? And I would like to add a third question, if you can answer them all together. There is a common phenomenon that many traditional, mainstream educational policymakers and apostles of the neoliberal right-wing administration refer to critical thinking or critical pedagogy as another initiative for learning. Do you think that such references from the right-wing ideologues fragment critical pedagogy and a way to build up a strategy, a war of position and tactics towards resistance?
Giannis, forgive me.
Yes.
I only really caught one element of that question, so I'll answer that. And then if you can repeat the other two, I'll try to, okay? Sorry.
That's all right.
The first question is about capitalism and democracy. Capitalism is not about democracy, and capitalism is the antithesis of democracy. And I think that we need to talk about what it means to develop an anti-capitalist consciousness coupled with an anti-capitalist international movement. So I think to the degree that we begin to claim that capitalism and democracy are similar or can collapse into each other, we fall prey to a kind of liberalism and a kind of reformism that, in my estimation, is really at the root of the problem. And not only at the root of the problem, but actually prolongs it. So that's off the table for me. I'm not interested in the presupposition that capitalism is a form of democracy. It organizes itself in ways that are based around exploitation, misery, inequality, exclusion, and disposability. I have no interest in capitalism in terms of its basic values. I think they're absolutely at odds with democracy. Now, what was the other two questions?
The other question has to do with those right-wing administrators who refer to critical pedagogy and critical thinking in our schools. And this one relates to the question, what about distant learning in schools in the era of pandemic? Can we have some comments on this matter from the critical pedagogy point of view? Because
I see. Okay, now I got it. Okay, yeah. No, I don't think. I mean, I think there are a couple of issues at stake here. I mean, I don't think that critical pedagogy is at odds with distance learning. I just think that we have to be careful about understanding distant learning in ways that often succumb to notions of privatization, commodification, and ways that undermine the social body and in particular spaces as being endemic and necessary for education, and also as a way to increasingly get rid of teachers and to de-dignify and de-skill their work. And I think this is really the issue. I'm concerned about how neoliberalism often enters into these conversations about distance learning in a way that seems to suggest they're pragmatic and might even say they have something to do with critical thinking, which of course you can have distance learning and inspire and energize kids. But at the same time, the structure and the ownership and the control of this modality of learning as it becomes increasingly corporatized and privatized is extremely dangerous. And I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example here in Canada. In Ontario, they have just passed a law, I believe, which suggests that distance learning, online learning, will now be handled by corporations. They've privatized it so that teachers may create the content, but they will do the mechanics. They will have power over the technology, and they will make demands. And they will say, well, you can buy this, but kids have to be exposed to this for so many hours a day. Or they say, teachers will get no remuneration for this. They won't be paid. I mean, this is very dangerous. This is really dangerous stuff. So we have to be careful. You can't separate the question of critical pedagogy and critical consciousness as a pedagogical tool from the larger apparatuses in which it takes place, and the question of who has ownership over those and what the values are that drive them.
There's another question. I don't know if we have time for another two or so. There's a question: what if governments implement citizenship programs which are nationalistic, whitewashed, and rather exclusionary? How are teachers, as communicators, as subjects of the state to do? How are they to use agency? And
I mean, look, I mean, Trump wants to institute what he calls patriotic education. The governor of Florida wants to eliminate any reference to slavery. Citizenship is an ambiguous term. And I think that the degree to which we equate it with matters of justice, equality, representation, exclusivity, it becomes something else, right? I mean, when you talk about citizenship as giving power to the people and creating the conditions for them to be dignified, critical, and engaged agents, I get it, and it makes sense. But I don't get it in terms of state boundaries. We should be talking about global citizenship. And what does that mean with respect to equity? What does it mean with respect to justice? Not exclusivity, not hyper-nationalism, not militarism. That's not about citizenship. That's just using citizenship to cover over particular forms of fascism. That's all that is.
And there is a question: how about irrationality? How irrationality relates to right-wing agenda nowadays?
Rationality or
irrationality? Irrationality.
I think irrationality has become a political currency that becomes valued because it sidesteps the question of reason, judgment, critically informed judgment, and what it means for people to exercise the capacity to govern rather than be governed. Irrationality is a systemic function of fascism, because what it does, it makes an appeal to mythic histories, it makes an appeal to conspiracy theories, it operates off lies, it demonizes people, it motivates and reinforces the language of hate. All of these things are irrational to any democracy, but they're very rational to people who hate democracy, because they have a certain political currency that's not only taken up in the schools, also taken up in the media. This stuff sells. It's sensationalism. I mean, you say you hate this, that, and this. You say people are viruses and toxic. You say people on the southern border refugees are vermin. I mean, this just generates, it seems to me, a simplified, highly packaged sort of message that bypasses the necessity for people to think critically.
Thank you for this. Do you have time for one more question? Saying, how can we explain the influence of right-wing ideology on some working class masses?
I think that in many ways, what we're talking about here is we're talking about a working class that has lacked the access to the kind of education that would offer them the possibility to be critically informed people. I mean, I think that, when you live a life of pure survival, where every day time is a deprivation rather than a luxury, and you have to make a choice between feeding your children and taking your medicine, there isn't a lot of time to think through certain kinds of issues. And I think in many ways, what often happens is that these strong men come along, they make outrageous promises, and I think that these things are very seductive. I also think there's a celebrity culture at work in Europe and the United States that diverts attentions away from real issues. We're talking about the power of two things. We're talking about an economic system that doesn't meet basic needs, and we're talking about disimagination machines that rob people of the ability to think critically and become actively engaged citizens.
I don't see any other questions. right now. Here, there is a question actually. I would like to hear Dr. Giroux talking about the primacy of students' voice and how can we promote it under these circumstances.
I think that we have to do everything we can to basically make it clear to students that to be voiceless is to be powerless. And I think pedagogically, there are all kinds of ways to overcome, it seems to me, that silencing of students. You know, young people have come to realize something, both in Greece, the United States. That's why they're in the streets. And what they've come to realize is that they've been written out of the script of democracy. And I think that we need to teach them about history and how young people in the past have struggled in very similar ways to resist the mechanisms of tyranny and authoritarianism. I think we need to look at the images that we see in the streets of Greece, in the streets of Portland, Oregon, where people are fighting and being beaten by the police as an example of what civic courage really is and what it looks like. I think that we need to expose young people to ways in which they can not only consume information, but they can become cultural producers and talk about it. They can analyze it. I think we have to know something about their lived experiences, and we have to learn how to make knowledge meaningful, to make it critical, to make it transformative.
I think that we have summed up the questions. We would like to thank you for your time and courage and thoughts and reflection, because while you were giving your speech, I was feeling like you describing what is happening here in Greece. So somehow there is a world, a globe, a universal situation where we're under a neoliberal attack, but we also have the optimism of resisting and creating spaces of critical and radical imagination.
I must say, my wife is Greek. She's very left, very political, and very smart. And I am being exposed to what's happening in Greece over the last 2 years. I just want to say to the Greek people who are watching this, you can fight this. This is not forever. Be courageous. This fascism will end. All they have is power. They don't have ideas. And it seems to me you have both.
Thank you, Professor. Helen will take the floor now.
Yes, okay. Λοιπόν, Yannis, thank you for your contribution and for supporting me in this amazing event. Professor Giroux, thank you for accepting our invitation. That was a great honor for us. I'd like to thank you for having been here with us, for sharing your thoughts, your ideas, your expertise. My personal respect goes out to you for bringing to our gathering a language of hope and a language of emancipation. Ladies and gentlemen, my respects and thanks also goes out to all of you. Our event has come to an end, at least for tonight. In the name of solidarity, I wish you all a very great evening. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.